Would you ever think of Yehoshua as a king? Probably not. Yet, the Rambam uses the induction of Yehoshua into leadership as an example of how we appoint a king, which raises a question because his induction does not seem to follow the protocols for the inauguration of a king. The question is why? The parasha Seinu in our parasha Mesubad Rabakoshes Moshe Makadosh Baruch Hu describes Moshe's request to the Eibusha Yifkid Hashem Gomer Isha La'ida, that the Eibusha should appoint a successor to lead the Jewish people. And my Hakadosh Baruch Hu, to which Hashem replies, Kach lechos Yeshua Benun Gomer, take Yehoshua, Samachtes Yodcha Alav, and place your hands in a form of smicha on his head. Moshe did that, and he placed his hands on Yeshua's head and inducted him as the next leader of the Jewish people. Now, what's interesting is when it comes to describing the halachas of how you inaugurate a king, the Rambam says, it is inappropriate to appoint a king unless you have a Sanhedrin, a basin of 70 elders, who are guided by a Navi that this should be the king. What's his proof? Ki Yehoshua, like Yehoshua, Moshe Rabbeinu, or Beis Dinoi, when Moshe Rabbeinu together with the Beis Din appointed Yehoshua as the king. Which implies that the Rambam would seem to be saying that Mino Yehoshua b'Parasha Seinu, Haya Inyan Shel Minoi Melech, that the appointment in our parasha of Yehoshua as the next leader of the Jewish people was to appoint him as a king, in which case we have to understand. Halei Rambam Atzmei Posak, didn't the Rambam himself rule that when you appoint a king, you have to pour the special oil over his head. How come Moshe did not do that to Yehoshua if he's inaugurating him as a king? You'll ask the question, but Moshe was also qualified as a king, and he didn't have anybody pour anointing oil on him. Even though Moshe is a king. There's an easy answer to that. That's because Moshe Rabbeinu becomes the leader/king of the Jewish people before there are laws of how to appoint a king and the laws to have such a thing as Shemen HaMishcha. So why is it that the Rambam says we learn from Yehoshua how you inaugurate a king, but there's no oil involved? Now, the easiest way to answer this would be by quoting a different halachic rendition of the Rambam, which is that the Rambam tells us we only use the Shemen HaMishcha for Kohanim Gedolim, or the Kohen Meshach Mechama, or for the Kelim of the Beis Hamikdash, or a king who is a descendant of David HaMelech. Easy answer. Seeing as Yehoshua is not a descendant of David HaMelech, he's not from that shevet at all. Obviously, he can't be a descendant of David HaMelech because he's before David HaMelech, but he's not from that shevet. That's why he wasn't anointed with the special oil. Easy answer, right? Except that when you examine what the Rambam says, but to the contrary, the Shitas Rambam means a tirutz. If you follow the Rambam's logic, this is a very poor answer. In fact, it's no answer at all. Why? Because to prove that a king is supposed to be anointed with oil, who does the Rambam quote? That Shmuel Hanavi took the vial of oil and he poured it on his head and he kissed him. Who's him? It's talking about the inauguration and the anointing of Shaul HaMelech, who's not part of the Davidic dynasty. Which would imply that the Rambam is of the view that Shaul HaMelech was anointed with anointing oil. Which proves that when the Rambam paskins that you have to anoint a king with oil, he's not making it a rule only for the descendants of David HaMelech, but for all kings. Even if they're not part of the Davidic dynasty. You see that in the Rambam's words. He says, when you inaugurate a king, or the king. The Rambam says later that we only apply the Shemen HaMishcha to kings that are from the dynasty of David. That's only once David had been inaugurated as a king because something changed fundamentally. When David HaMelech was appointed as a king, then he was the one who earned the rights to royalty for himself and his family forever. But any king prior to that would also have Shemen HaMishcha, proof being Shaul HaMelech, raising the question, why doesn't Yehoshua have oil as part of his induction? We're back to our original question. Why was Yehoshua not anointed? According to the Rambam, he is clearly somebody who is qualified as a king. So why is he not given b'shem HaMishcha? In the same way, Shaul HaMelech was anointed, as the Rambam pointed out. So, in order to understand this, let's understand something very interesting about the appointment of Yehoshua. Why is he the successor to Moshe Rabbeinu and not Moshe Rabbeinu's own children? So let's analyze what the Medrash says. When Moshe Rabbeinu said to the Eibishter, please appoint a successor, the Medrash says that Moshe Rabbeinu reasoned he believed that his children would inherit his greatness, his position. To which the Eibishter said, the person who put in the effort to plant the tree, the fig, he's the person who will be able to eat its fruits. Which the Medrash explains that the Eibishter is telling Moshe Rabbeinu, your children sat back and they did not engage fully in Torah learning, and therefore they cannot be your successors. Whereas Yehoshua, but on the other hand, Yehoshua, he was completely dedicated to you as the absolute model of a student, so therefore he should be the next leader of the Jewish people. Now, but that actually doesn't really seem to make sense because considering that the children of Moshe Rabbeinu sat back, so to speak, and did not engage in learning Torah, surely Moshe Rabbeinu knew that. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu even believe for a moment that they were suitable to be his successors, if it's so obvious that they were not invested in Torah in the way that they should be? So maybe the easiest way to explain is that Moshe Rabbeinu's request that he's asking for a leader of the people is he wasn't asking for a teacher par excellence to take over from his position, but it would seem maybe he was asking for something much more practical. In his words, he says this should be a king who goes out in front of them and brings them back, which means la milchama, a military leader. And maybe that's why Moshe Rabbeinu believed that his children were suitable candidates, despite the fact that they were not as invested in Torah as Yehoshua was, because we know that the position of royalty is an inherited position, and from the perspective of being the military leaders of the Jewish people, as Moshe Rabbeinu had been, Amalek, Sichon, Oig, etc., so his children surely deserve that position. Now, if that is the case, and that is what Moshe Rabbeinu was thinking, then we don't understand the Eibishter's response, because the Eibishter's response is they didn't learn Torah properly. If that's not what Moshe was asking, then how's that an answer? What does Eibishter say? They sat back, they didn't plant the fig, so they can't eat the fruit. If we're talking about military leadership or political leadership, why is Torah relevant over here? Isn't the issue at hand over here being the ones to inherit the royalty position? So, to understand this, we're going to look at Megala Amukos. Megala Amukos was a sefer from the 16th century, which was all about translating and sharing the teachings of the Arizal. So Biras Kefal HaLashon B'Pasuk, he detects that in the language that Moshe Rabbeinu uses, he actually uses a double expression. First he says, that we're looking for a leader who will go out in front of the people and come in front of the people. And then he says again, and who will take them out and will bring them in. Sounds like this is unnecessary language. So therefore, says the Megala Amukos, Moshe was actually requesting two heads of the community, two leaders. One of which would be their military political leader and lead them in all practical areas of Jewish life. And another one who would lead them through the study of Torah. To which the Eibishter replied, no, there's going to be a single leader. Yehoshua sheyeh melech ve'abezin shel Yisrael ve'chacham shem she'Torah. Yehoshua is going to have both roles. He'll be the melech and he'll be the abezin, which means he's going to be the person who is their great teacher of Torah. Why? Because we have a principle that you can never have two kings sharing a crown. Because, as we know, there's a single spokesperson or leader of the community per generation, and you can't have more than one. Which also helps to clarify what the Medrash had raised. Because Moshe believed that there was a possibility for two leaders, one the political leader, the king, the other the spiritual leader, the Abezdin. Then it would make logical sense why he suggested that one of his children should be a leader, at least one of the leaders, the political leader. So that was Moshe's proposal, but the Eibish's choice was and there should be a single leader who will have both roles, a dual role, spiritual and political. Now, if the leader has to also fulfill the Torah role, and therefore obviously he has to be suitable for it, the person who's invested in Torah should be the one to reap the benefits of leading and teaching. Whereas Moshe Rabbeinu's children do not fit the bill for the spiritual leadership because they were not properly invested in Torah learning. So therefore, they are unfortunately unable to inherit Moshe's greatness and his honor and his position, because his greatness and honor has to also include spiritual leadership, and they're not up to the task. Whereas Yehoshua is completely dedicated to Torah. Not only was he a person who was a great student, but he attended to Moshe Rabbeinu, and as we know, the Gemara tells us that to be somebody who hangs around with and supports the Talmidei Chachamim is greater than even just learning from them. Therefore, he is the prime candidate to take Moshe's position. So now it makes a lot of sense to us. Moshe had one vision of leadership, and the Eibusha corrects it to a different vision of leadership, and only Yehoshua could fit that bill. So if that's the case, we still have a question. Why? Why wasn't the Eibusha willing to accept Moshe's proposal to have two leaders, especially when you consider that most of history, that is how Jewish leadership worked? Yes, it is a valid argument to say two kings cannot share a single crown. That is, if it is a single crown. But if one is the leader politically and militarily, that's one crown, and another is the spiritual leader, that's a different crown. What's the problem? Look at Jewish history. That is how Jewish leadership worked. There was one person who was the king, and somebody else was the head of the Sanhedrin. One person was the spiritual leader, the Torah leader. As the Rambam describes it, the greatest out of all the members of the Sanhedrin, you appoint as the head of the entire Sanhedrin. He carries the title Nasi. And he is the spiritual heir to Moshe Rabbeinu. And then besides that, there's somebody else who's the king, who looks after all the other practical needs and military and political needs and even economic needs of the people. And in the time after the Churban, there was what's called the Reish Galusa. Again, there was a person who was in charge of the political position of the Jewish people. In fact, the king may not be a member of the Sanhedrin. He saw the Sanhedrin, as the Rambam says. So what's the big deal? Why is Moshe's proposal so outrageous that the Eibusha says, no, we have to have a single leader? Unless, of course, therein lies the answer. Being a king and being the head of the Torah world are two completely different kinds of leadership. And therefore, there is no reason why having two leaders should be in a conflict. If there's no conflict. Back to our question. Why is it impossible in the generation following Moshe Rabbeinu to have two different leaders? And that the Eibishter insists there has to be a single leader and it has to be Yehoshua. So to understand that, we need to identify something absolutely unique about Yehoshua's position in the community, which, by the way, is the only person throughout the whole of history who has the same experience as Moshe Rabbeinu. What does that mean? The explanation is this. As we well know in his introduction to the Yad HaChazaka, to the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam gives us the entire chain of tradition of the oral Torah, Moshe ve'ad Rav Ashi, from Moshe Rabbeinu until Rav Ashi, who consolidated the Gemara. Of a minyan mekabel Torah diak Rambam b'lashonai. The Rambam is very specific in the language that he uses to describe the chain of transition, because aploini kibel mi ploini hamekabel akodim. So he would say so and so received the oral tradition from the sage who preceded him, but then he would say ubeis dinoi, the sage who preceded him, and his best in oy v'chaverav, or his colleagues, depending if you're talking about the prophets or you're talking about later when there was a formalized based in and a nav based in. And elsewhere in a letter that the Rambam wrote, he says the reason he did this was because he needed to emphasize that the chain of Jewish tradition is groups of people who learned from groups of people rather than individuals who received information from individuals. But there's an exception. What's the exception? When it comes to Yehoshua, there the Rambam specifically says differently. Many sages received the Torah from Yehoshua, and it doesn't say and his colleagues or and his Beis Din. Why? The reason is because of something the Rambam already told us, which is Torah Shabbal Peh Linda Moshe Rabbeinu Kulab Beis Din Bebeis L'Shivim Zekenim. Moshe Rabbeinu taught the entire Torah Shabbal Peh together with his Beis Din to the 70 elders who were, so to speak, the custodians of Torah. Ve'Elazar or Pinchas v'Yehoshua shloshtan kiblu mi-Moshe. They're three unique individuals who got direct information from Moshe Rabbeinu. That's Elazar, the son of Aaron HaKohen, Pinchas, the grandson, and Yehoshua. Yehoshua says the Rambam, Yehoshua, who is the star student of Moshe Rabbeinu, Mosa Torah Shebal Peh, he handed over the Torah Shebal Peh, Vetzivohu Oleha, and he instructed him with all the details relevant to Torah Shebal Peh. Kloimar, in other words, Yehoshua was not just one of the recipients of Moshe's Torah, like the other very important people, the Zkenim, Pinchas, Elazar. But the language the Rambam tells us is that specifically to Yehoshua, Moshe handed over the entire Torah Shabbal Peh. Or Kamaim Mishnah, as we see in the first Mishnah of Pirkei Avos, Moshe kibel Torah mi Sinai umesoro Yehoshua. That Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah, and so to speak, as he received it, so he transferred it to Yehoshua. And Yehoshua had special instruction with regards to Torah. That's why when the Rambam speaks about Yehoshua as a chain in the transmission of Torah, he does not speak about Yehoshua and his Beis Din, because when Yehoshua is the one transmitting Torah, he is the sole transmitter of Torah at that point in history. Why? Because he's the only person in that entire generation who received all of the information directly from Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore, in a sense, he has the most pristine version of the Torah to be able to pass on. That means that there's a fundamental difference between Moshe and Yehoshua as leaders and teachers of Torah, compared to the head of any Sanhedrin ever in history. Because Yehoshua, Moshe Rabbeinu, Shabbat Bekach, Yehoshua and Moshe share a unique greatness, that they are people who got everything packaged and handed to them in a way that was not to occur throughout the rest of history. When the Rambam tells us that the head of the Sanhedrin is the spiritual heir to Moshe Rabbeinu, that's in a very specific sense. It means that in the same way as Moshe Rabbeinu was the senior authority over the 70 elders who were under him, likewise the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, is the greatest member of the Sanhedrin and therefore presides over them and they're, so to speak, under his direction. But in terms of transmission of all of the information of Torah, the Nasi does not stand alone as the one individual responsible from Moshe Rabbeinu to transmit the Torah. But he's part of a group, as the Rambam was medayek, that it has to be a transmission from groups to groups. And that tells us that there is a very significant difference between the time when Moshe and Yehoshua are the leaders versus other times in history where we have the whole Sanhedrin. And in all those other time periods, there are two leaders of the community, the spiritual Torah leader and the political, military, economic leader, and they're two different roles. But in the time of Moshe and Yehoshua, that cannot be the case. Because even though a Nasi of the Sanhedrin at any point in history is the very highest echelon of spirituality, but he doesn't have the same authority over the community as a king does. Not only authority, but he doesn't have the same elevation as a king. Because the definition of a king is in al gabov el avay lekov. He is answerable only directly to the Eibishter. That doesn't only mean he is the supreme authority. Not only is he the supreme authority, technically he doesn't even have to consult. There's one dabar, there's one spokesperson for the generation. Because there's only a single king, and there can never be multiple kings simultaneously. That's different to the person who is the head of the Sanhedrin. He is one of the members of the Sanhedrin. He happens to be the presiding chief of the Sanhedrin, but he is one of the members, and there's 71 of them. And it should be it's just because he is the most wise out of all of them, therefore he is their head. He doesn't have that same authority and uniqueness that a king has. And therefore, to be the head of the Sanhedrin doesn't undermine the position of the king. So it's not like you have two kings. The king is a unique personality who has supreme authority in the community. The Nasi is the greatest of a conglomerate of people that sit on the Sanhedrin. There's no contest. Whereas in the case of Moshe and Yehoshua, their leadership is completely different. Their leadership as giants of Torah is it's not just because they sit on a group of the great Torah leaders of the Jewish people and happen to be the greatest. But Moshe has something nobody else has. He got the Torah from Sinai. In the same way as a king is absolutely unique and the highest authority, Moshe Rabbeinu is absolutely unique in his reception of the Torah and the absolute authority. And that was then transmitted to Yehoshua because Mosar Yehoshua, as the Rambam told us, that he handed over all of that Torah Shabbat to Yehoshua, which never happens again. So in that context, when you're dealing with individuals, Moshe and Yehoshua, who have such an incredibly elevated sense of connection to Torah and holiness, then if we're going to now split the roles, we're going to say one will be the supreme authority of political things like going to war, and the other is the supreme authority of Torah. Then you'd be speaking about two spokespeople, two people who have supreme authority in two different areas. That is a contradiction. You can only have one supreme authority. Okay, so we're starting to understand the difference and why it is that the Eibishter would not be willing to have two leaders at that point in history, but there's still something that we have to clarify. Whichever way you look at it, there are still two different kinds of leadership. Political military leadership is completely different to Torah leadership. So again, why consider two people vying for the same authority? They're not. They might be supreme authorities in their respective areas, but they're not vying for the same authority. So the answer to that is, let's remind ourselves what a Jewish king is supposed to be. When it comes to what the role and purpose of a king is, the Rambam tells us, his goal and purpose and thought should be to elevate the truth of Yiddishkeit, and to fill the world with justice, and to break the power of those who are wicked people, and to fight the battles of Hashem. The only reason to appoint a king is to bring law and order and to fight appropriate wars. In other words, a Jewish king is not like the king of any other nation whose responsibility is solely to look after the people and make sure that the economy is strong and everybody has what they need. What sits at the core of a Jewish king is his responsibility to elevate Torah. Lehorim daso emes, as the Rambam calls it. To ensure that we keep the laws of the Torah. To the extent that the Rambam describes that the wars that the king has to fight are wars for the Eibishter's sake, not the country's sake, not the nation's sake, the Eibishter's sake. In other words, to be a Jewish king is an extension of the role of the Beis Din, the ultimate Beis Din. Because Beis Din HaGadol, again, we're going to quote the Rambam. What is the purpose of the highest court in Judaism? They're supposed to be the pillars of direction for the community. Who then dispense law for the Jewish people. What's the purpose of a king? That the law of Torah, which is dispensed from the Beis Din HaGadol, should be upheld and kept by the Jewish people. In other words, the king is a direct extension of the role of the Beis Din. Therefore, the halacha is that the king has to show tremendous respect to those who are the students of Torah. And when the Sanhedrin and the sages come consult with him or advise him, he has to stand out of respect for them because they are the source of his power and responsibility. And likewise, if he has to go and ask advice for the Kohen Gadol using the Urim V'Tumim, the king has to stand for the Kohen Gadol. Because the king is actually a recipient of their spirituality and their greatness and so on. But when the king has to then be the authority of the people, then we say there's no higher authority than the king himself. Only the Eibishter is above him. There's no greater position in the community. In the public space, he doesn't show any respect to any person because they have to be in awe of him. And therefore you cannot suggest that the king as a leader and the Beis Din as leadership are independent of each other, Torah leadership and practical leadership, and say they neither one, so to speak, trespasses on the other. It's a single continuum. Freedom, if we separate the two, then we'd be implying that there's two kings sharing a crown. So where you don't have somebody of the caliber of Moshe Rabbeinu, the caliber of Yoshua, who received Torah directly, then you don't have this problem. You can put somebody as the head of the Sanhedrin, and it's not going to be a contradiction to the Torah. But when you have somebody at that level, they have to be both leaders. And now we can answer our original question. How come it is that to appoint Yeshua as a king, it's Moshe Rabbeinu putting his hands on his head and not pouring the Shemen HaMishcha as you'd expect for a king? Once we have defined that a king is somebody who has to receive from, be guided by the Beis Din HaGadol, and therefore fulfill his responsibilities to uphold Torah, well, then you can understand if you're talking about Yeshua, from Moshe or Moshe's leadership, They are unique individuals because they have both elements of supreme authority. Hein melech, they are kings in terms of leading the nation. Ve'hein asiyas haTorah v'dargas melech kanal, and they are unique that there's nobody greater than them in learning Torah, in the same way as there's nobody greater than the king. Then their leadership is a result of their Torah greatness, not a result of the Beis Din inspiring them. In other words, Yehoshua and certainly Moshe Rabbeinu, their primary role and their primary greatness is within Torah. Because these are the only two people in history who are able to transmit the whole pristine, absolute Torah to the next generation. And they also have the role of a king to ensure that the Jewish people are learning and fulfilling what the Torah requires. So how does Yeshua get to have this position? Smicha, the symbol of Torah leadership. Anointing a king is in order to establish that person as a king. Like Shaul who doesn't have any royal blood up until that point, so he has to be established as a king. The way you do that is you pour anointing oil on him. Whereas Yehoshua, who's the king, why? Because he's completely invested in learning Torah, and he was Masharis Moshe. So his primary leadership is in the sphere of Torah, where he is this unique individual who's not receiving but giving. So what is the indicator of his leadership? Smicha, placing your head. Smicha is the indication of Torah leadership. Because the expression that we use to describe the transmission of Torah leadership is smicha. And that would also explain the fact that the Medrash tells us Shaul was the first king. Is not a contradiction to the fact that we have a lot of evidence to suggest that Moshe and Yoshua were kings. So how do you say Shaul was the first king? Ki Geder HaMelucha, but Moshe v'Yoshua, or you get a Shein Elegami Mimalchus Shaul v'David. Because the kind of king that Moshe and Yehoshua were is a completely different kind of king to what Shaul and David were. But Moshe v'Yehoshua is an Nesius HaMelucha David Tafel Nesiusam B'Torah, unlike Shaul and David HaMelech, where their Malchus becomes their primary indicator, their primary characteristic, their primary role. For Moshe and Yehoshua, being the king is secondary to their role as the absolute teachers of Torah. That will explain why it is that there's no clear message in the Torah that says, thou shalt anoint a king with oil in order to induct him. It's really strange. Seeing as the Torah expressly tells us that we have to appoint a king. And many of the details of what it means to appoint a king are in fact detailed in the Torah. Surely one of those details which is relevant is the anointing of oil. Just like the Torah tells us that you have to anoint a Kohen Gadol. The Torah tells us that you have to anoint the special Kohen who's going to lead the Jewish people into war. How come it doesn't speak about anointing a king? Based on what we've explained over here, it's actually self-evident. Because the way that the Torah describes a king and the characters of kings who are in the 5 books of the Chumash, Moshe and Yehoshua, is a king who is the Nasi, the ultimate authority of Torah. So he doesn't need the Shem HaMishcha to give him the power of a king, because he has it innately by virtue of the fact that the king is an extension of Torah, and this is the Nasi HaTorah. The idea that there has to be a king anointed in oil, that is something that comes into play only in later generations, when Shaul becomes the king, and so therefore there's no reason for the Torah to describe it in advance, because in the time of Moshe and Yehoshua it is completely unnecessary.